Hey, what's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor O'Gara. Will, opening weekend of the NCAA tournament is in the books. It was great, except if you're a Kentucky fan or an Auburn fan.
An SEC fan, pretty much, almost across the board.
Yeah, Tennessee and Alabama fans would beg to differ on that. Not the best weekend of basketball for SEC hoops, but it was very entertaining, and that's about all I could possibly ask for. I'm a bit gassed right now. I'm gonna be honest with you. I try and be as transparent as possible. I don't have my fastball today. We're working the off speed stuff. That's okay. Sometimes you gotta get a little bit crafty. We're doing what we can though, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that this time of year. You got to see Tommy Tanks this weekend. How was that?
Yes, I did. And question for you: are you more winded than DJ Burns right now?
No, because I am of the impression that man is just not actually a human being, and he operates in a different space than I do. So, well, I'll say that I am more winded than DJ Burns. Yeah,
Yeah, he's of that kind of nose tackle NFL mold where it's like the motor just doesn't stop. Shout out Vince Wilfork. But speaking of big boys, yeah, I got to go see Tommy Tanks. I was there for the only game that LSU won. So
there you go.
Louisiana State University, if you want to send your boys some tickets, I'm just saying, there were comebacks. There was a rough strike zone, but yet the boys prevailed when I was there. Did my duty. But yeah, it was a great experience. If you guys haven't made it out to Alex Box or really see any college baseball, it's a really fun. It's one of the most fun I've had at a sporting event. Just because of the atmosphere, how chill it was, how easy it was to get around. Obviously, the ballpark in Hoover, I've been to a ton, just going to high school there and being able to cover that a little bit. But yeah, if you guys are just kind of bored, and football season and March Madness is not at your university, obviously it's at offsite. So if you guys have a free weekend, I would definitely go check out one of the great, gosh, so many SEC baseball teams are ranked right now.
Never have I ever been to an SEC baseball game.
Really?
Never. Yeah, I've been to the College World Series, but I have not been to an SEC baseball game. And need to. Absolutely need to. I've been to plenty of college baseball games because of my brother. But yeah, for whatever reason, just with the way that the job is set up, not exactly covering college baseball until things heat up right around College World Series time. But need to, because the atmosphere is across the board. I mean, just look incredible. Like getting a ticket for that game. And I remember talking about this a few weeks ago, like getting a ticket for Florida LSU was probably not an easy thing to do. Like, didn't you have to you had to get a little bit creative to be able to get like somewhat affordable seats for that?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up with great seats, but it was one of those situations where, like, let's say the get-in price was like 100 to 150, and I was like, well, I'd rather just spend low 200s at that point and get a good seat because there's not really a difference in terms of like price tier. So yeah, I did that. But I mean, the thing that's cool too, and to your point, it's like we cover a lot of national stuff here, like in terms of football, March Madness, that type of stuff. But the thing that's cool about college baseball, like exactly to your point, man, like you call the LSU box office and they're used to these tickets being, $30 or whatever for like a random Wednesday game. And they're like, oh yeah, dude, like you need to get there a couple hours early, park in this lot, boom, boom, boom. And so point being, like, that's the thing that, we kind of fall in love with sports growing up. And you see this a ton in minor league baseball, which is like your community, right? Like LSU's baseball park, Alex Box has like a big Tony Sacheries can as one of their like sponsors. Like that stuff, I love that stuff. Just in terms of, you go to A&M and you see local sponsorships, you see local car dealerships like buying ads in a way that you wouldn't see in Tiger Stadium or in like A&M Stadium. Yeah. So point being, like, I don't know. I think it's the best way to support your school is to go to sports that everybody's not, like, it's not people flying from all over to go see, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, some of the lower revenue sports for sure. Good way to be able to help out the university. We got a great show lined up. Great show. David Hale of ESPN is going to join us to talk through this lawsuit, this counter lawsuit that's going on right now between Florida State, Clemson, the ACC, their path to try and get out of this grant of rights deal and what all that looks like, some of the timeline stuff, where they could even go if this were to happen. If you're one of those people right now that's seeing some of these headlines, you're like, I can't really make sense of this. I promise this conversation will be able to put some of those things in perspective. David was there in the courtroom, so knows this stuff very, very well and is learning this stuff very, very well. Then we've got the final jersey contest entry that you are wearing right now, a jersey that I'm going to save who it is for later. If you know who Bethel who went to Bethel. If you want to hop on Wikipedia, you can see Will. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that. You can probably figure this out, but we'll save that for after the interview. So final jersey contest entry, and then we're going to do lad of the week. But first, Will, I thought it would be a good time to do the villains of college football in 2024, kind of in light of a couple things. No more Connor Stallions in college football. We've got this Kim Mulkey thing right now, who's, let's be honest, like, no matter how you feel about Kim Mulkey, like, she's leaning into her villain role more than ever, probably. It seems like. I thought it'd be interesting to look at it from a college football perspective of who are the villains in 2024. And I added the 2024 part because I think there is a certain timeliness that's important to being a villain. You could just not like someone, but like, the Joker doesn't become his most villainous self until he starts holding all of Gotham City hostage. That is the first comic book reference I've ever made in the history of the Saturday Down South podcast. So you're welcome. And I'm not saying that any of the following people are like Joker levels of villain or anything like that hateable. It's not like some Brian Bosworth situation or something like that. We've had more peak villains in college football, but I do think there is a certain level of current relevance that matters with the people that would qualify as villains. For example, a villain isn't just your rival school. Like that's kind of an easy one. You probably always dislike them. It doesn't really depend on the specific year or anything like that. Maybe they have a quarterback that you think is overhyped, but chances are you dislike them, and it doesn't really change a whole lot the variance of that year to year. So that's not what we're really looking to find, because that's a bit too subjective and perhaps probably too specific to a particular fan base. What I want to do is kind of find the inverse of America's team. Like, we do that episode of 4th of July. One of my favorite things that we do. And we talk about like all these likability qualities. And so we're going to do that, and not just related to teams, but personalities, players, all that stuff. I want to find the characters in this sport that everyone seems to pile on when something doesn't go well for them. Where if something bad is happening, you can search their name on Twitter and it's just going to be tweet after tweet after tweet of just getting dunked on. Because that's, being honest, kind of what it seemed like for Kim Mulkey. Anytime there was a new development in the Connor Stallions thing, that like you could set your watch to it, that was happening. A uniform can amplify that, but it's not the lone factor in being a villain. Villains are made by people. For example, like Duke is always considered the villain, but the Kyle Filipowski court storming thing, and then the tripping, like that whole situation, two separate things, but I guess it's tied to the same person. That makes Duke more of a villain than it was at this time last year, when I would argue they're actually a lot more likable with John Shire taking over for Coach K, but that's more subjective from me. So does that all make sense as to what goes into being a villain at this particular time in 2024?
Yes. And this is one of those things where, like, you texted me, you're like, hey, like, if you have any thoughts, let me know. I wanted to just let you fully build this in your mind, because this is one of the few topics that I feel like we could completely go separate ways on and both end up having a point. So I didn't want to get in here and just completely like alter the trajectory, but I will start with this because Duke is a great point. Do you think there are any brands that are inherently evil, that almost not evil, but like hated?
I think that Ohio State is the one that's probably going to get the most if you're coming up with that, just because I think there is very much an outside impression that Ohio State fans are absolutely nuts, that they are spoiled, that they get to play in the more favorable conference. So sometimes they don't earn their path to be able to get to a national championship. And then the struggles with the SEC teams in the postseason, those are well documented. I think if there's a team that fits into that description, it is Ohio State. But I think in college football, it's a little bit more regional than national when it comes to that. So I don't know that that's the fairest thing to say. Like, if you hate Ohio State, you probably just hate them, and it's not really it's not dependent so much on a certain player. Maybe a little bit when Tate Martell was there, but he didn't even become a starter. Like, if he had become a starter, maybe that's a little bit different. But I think about Johnny Manziel coming back 2013, right? Like, that year, I don't know that he was a villain in a traditional sense, because I think there was a lot of people saying, this guy's living his best life
Yep.
and is doing what all of us wish we could be doing at his age. But he's obviously making a lot of these mistakes that puts him in a a negative light from a national perspective. So that's probably not the best way to answer that question. But I don't know that it's fair to apply that to one specific brand and say that they are inherently evil.
Yes, I think that, and the thing too that makes it difficult is like, so even let's take a Duke, right? They only have that vibe in basketball, because if you look at what Elko did at Duke, we go, okay, like I respect that you're working on all these restrictions. They are a scrappy underdog in football, right? I think there are only a couple. I think Ohio State is a great one. I think pretty much any team that has seemingly unlimited resources, I think, is across the board detracted, because it feels like they're playing with a different set of rules. So like a Miami is a good example. There are people that will hate Miami in basketball because they're like, oh, you guys are paying your players. In football, same deal. I think that for similar reasons, A&M can kind of have that same vibe. And that's probably the only SEC team that I would say that for, because like Alabama basketball was plucky and cool when they started being pretty good, like under Avery and stuff. So yeah, I think that like anytime, like the only commonality that when I see a logo and I think I don't like that is about financial success, right? You guys have the best training rooms, you guys have the best like everything, and your mistakes don't matter because you could just pay Jimbo 75 mil or whatever and then get Elko in from Duke, right, who is now a poor school. So yeah, I think that's the only thing worth noticing, is that anytime you feel like it's unfair, like now Michigan with the cheating. Anytime there's something that feels unfair and they're knowingly kind of either skirting the rules or playing with a different deck, I think that can unify you. But to your point, and I love that, it's like it's mostly regional, right? Because, for me, if LSU's rival, let's just take Alabama, for instance. Alabama baseball or Alabama basketball would not have that same hatred from a, I don't know, Michigan fan, right? But like one other one that comes to mind that I didn't say is USC. I think USC pretty much across all sports, I'm like, you guys are SoCal elitists. I'm out of here.
Yeah, look, you could point to specific seasons and say, all right, I didn't want to root for Cam Newton at Auburn in 2010, right? Of a guy that obviously like there's all this stuff about the NCAA stuff, and I think that puts that program in a negative light. So I find myself rooting against them as they continue to win games. Now, yep. I think so. That's why I think the year is important to bring up, because honestly, and what's weird about this job is like I think there are certain teams that I think are incredibly likable one year, and then 2 years later, I'm just like banging the drum about how overhyped they are,
yep.
how ridiculous it is that this coach made this decision and this quarterback is not worthy of Heisman consideration. So like I do truly think it's more year to year for this argument. Now you could say like, hey, this team is I just dislike them, and they have a lot of, a national brand that's easy to root against. People would say Notre Dame.
I was just thinking, I forgot Notre Dame. How did I do that? I think that's a good one because they combine the whole, so there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, but like that's what I wonder about now in the current context is like, what makes current Notre Dame hateable? It's stuff that we would talk about from 30 years ago. Is it, oh, well, they're fans. Yeah, I mean, their fans have a certain bravado. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My grandpa was a Notre Dame fan. I had moments in my life where, like, hey, back when I was rooting for Tommy Zbikowski in the day, like, because he went to my high school, and Jeff Samardzija he and Jeff Samardzija would like show up at my high school, and we'd be like, oh my God, this is so cool. Everybody just roots for Notre Dame. Yeah, it would be like a murmur in school. It'd be like, hey, Zbikowski and Samardzija are like downstairs in the locker room right now. Go try and sneak a peek. But like, I think even that shows you it's cyclical. Like, is Notre Dame hateable with Marcus Freeman more so than it was with Brian Kelly, or did that change? Like, I think personalities make villains more in college sports in general than just simply like the team, because that is often tied to your specific association with them, not so much a national hatred of them, if that makes sense.
Yes, 100%. I think these are all good and worth discussing because, again, you probably have plenty of people like yelling at the radio, like, how do you not always hate whatever school they Arkansas? Sure. I don't. There's no reason I would, because they haven't done anything to me, so I'm just sitting here chilling. But yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay, so let's start with guys who put a firm target on themselves this offseason and could be labeled as villains in college football for different reasons this year. Trevor Etienne and Caden Proctor.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with Etienne. He was a member of last year's All Bang the Drum team, somebody that we have talked about ad nauseum, a guy that I love to watch, who is now in a very polarizing position. For starters, he crossed enemy lines, obviously, going from Florida to Georgia. It's a bold move, even in the portal era. If you think that doesn't put a target on you, go talk to guys like Jermaine Burton, Brenton Cox, who left Georgia for rivals like Alabama and Florida. When those guys messed up, you heard about it. Okay. Brenton Cox wasn't getting enough sacks or something like that. You heard about it. When Jermaine Burton had a drop or had a game that he was invisible or had a game where he did something he shouldn't have done in a post game scuffle, you heard about it. There were moments that felt magnified with them because they made those decisions, and ETN will probably be subject to that as well. And we know that based on what happened over the weekend. When he messed up early on Sunday morning, you heard about it. Arrested on 4 misdemeanors, including DUI. Not great. Not great when that's already a well-documented issue for Georgia, and you come in and add to a topic that we were talking about a lot last year. And coming off of the 2022 title, it was like, oh man, is this going to derail Georgia's national championship chances? Kirby have a discipline problem? Is he losing the program? All these different things. And look, I'm not sure what type of punishment he'll face, so I'm not going to sit here and project. It's probably worth remembering that Georgia opens the season against Clemson, which in the ETN family, probably a pretty big deal if I had to guess. Not sure if he's going to miss that game. If he does get to play for that game, maybe that puts an even bigger target on his back. And it's like, why isn't Kirby suspending him? Kirby did suspend Javon Bullard for his suspension or for his DUI back in 2022. So kind of TBD on that. I don't know if he's going to apply that same logic. I don't know. Whatever the case is, ETN is now a guy that's not just going to be scrutinized by Florida fans, but he's kind of giving college football fans a reason to look at him with an eyebrow raised. And some of that is also because of, like I said, he brought on a little bit more pressure by going on Real Talk with fellow Georgia player Tate Ratledge and delivering this quote. To sum it up, I could either be running back 2 on a losing team, Florida, or go somewhere like I wanted to play in December too. That's also a big part in me transferring. I could stay and be running back 2 on a losing team or go somewhere and possibly be running back 1 and win a natty. Close quote. If ETN is anything less than great this year and Georgia is, not winning a national championship or something like that, if he doesn't check those 2 boxes, he's going to hear about it from a whole lot of people, not just Florida fans who want to clown on him, because there are a lot of people that would have loved to have had Trevor Etienne in the transfer portal that maybe feel scorned. Maybe LSU fans feel that way as well. But I think he has probably not helped himself and has put a bigger target on his back and is now being probably considered as more of a villain than he could have been considered as a hero if he had just simply stepped in, had like a really quiet offseason, and he's just awesome for Georgia. I think it's a little bit different now.
Yeah, I think that, and this goes into the nuance of this whole thing, which to me, I think that quote by itself is not that big of a deal. But then when you read between the lines and think, oh, he's talking about Florida as a losing team and their rival, Georgia, is a winning team. And then exactly to your point, it's hard to even talk about the speed. I don't even know what you would call the continual issue at Georgia, maybe just speeding, because not all of it's drinking related, whatever. But it's obviously some type of a pretty big scale issue over there. So that's the other thing is that you kind of had to tell yourself, okay, here's the one thing I'm not going to do if I go to Georgia. I want to be liked by anyone but Georgia fans. Is let's try to make it seem like I'm doing this and being business oriented, right? So I think that quote's fine. But then you're hitting on another point here, which is I think it is fine to hold college athletes that enter the transfer portal to a similar standard of pro athletes that switch teams to their rival. And the reason for that is it's the same incentives, right? It's money, it's, winning, it's all these different things. So if he gives that quote and says, I'm going to a winning team, and he goes to Michigan, I don't think Florida fans are that mad. I think it's because he called them losers and he called Georgia winners, and to that point, that's where the destination matters than the act itself.
Yeah. And that, I think, Georgia fans are like, yeah, he's our guy now. We like him. But that kind of speaks to this day and age and this lack of loyalty and talking about, oh, well, nobody wants to stay with their program that they signed up to play for, and it's just free agency. So it speaks to the bigger picture issue in college football as a whole right now.
Mm-hmm.
Caden Proctor, also a guy that falls into that camp, but for a very different, I'd say, set of circumstances that he has allowed to unfold. Not just an Iowa thing with him, though obviously Iowa fans have to feel incredibly scorned after the 5-star Iowa native, which there are not a whole lot of those in the state of Iowa. He was verbally committed to the Hawkeyes as a recruit. He flips to Bama. He spends a year at Bama. He hits the portal. He transfers to Iowa. Iowa self-reported a level 3 violation for tampering with Proctor and basically admitting, yeah, we were texting with him during his freshman year, being like, hey, how are things going? Which, why wouldn't you? And why would you self-report tampering? Because tampering isn't something the NCAA cares to investigate because it's basically above their pay grade at this point. But anyway, they still did it. They still were like, yeah, you know what? We did it. Oh, well, slap on our own wrist, level 3. They do all this, and then he still ends up going back to Bama 2 months after saying that he was going to Iowa. A mess, just an absolute mess. I can close my eyes and picture the kids these days conversations that will be happening at Easter dinners across America talking about this Caden Proctor situation and how there is no more loyalty in the sport. This is a sign of everything that is wrong. Our guy Aaron Murray went so far as to say, quote, this is going to ruin college football. Look, there are a lot of people.
This being Proctor?
This being what Caden Proctor has done. Yes.
I wonder what he had to say about ETN. That's interesting.
The back and forth. Here's the thing. To his point, and look, I would disagree that it's going to ruin college football. Okay, I'll tell that to Aaron's face. I'll text him right after we finish this. I would disagree that it's going to ruin college football. But the lack of portal restrictions and the ability to go here, there, wherever, oh, I'm going back and forth in spring, it's going to impact so many of these teams. And Josh Pate has hinted at this, that the spring window that's going to open up in a couple of weeks is going to put college football fans in a tizzy. And it's going
to... Well, not us in the SEC, Connor, because we can't have interconference transfers, so we'll be sitting on our hands.
True. Very good point. But maybe that means it's a one-way street in the SEC. Yeah. And that's even worse. And it's not like, oh, hey, we just got this guy from Auburn. Ooh, this guy from Arkansas just signed. Like, it will be probably even worse then for SEC teams. And maybe this is going to be magnified because of the fact that you have this ability to keep doing this. And you say like, oh, well, why is he able to announce that he's transferring? It's like, well, he's going to officially enter the spring window, and that's what it's going to end up looking like. But Proctor, again, if you're the face of what's wrong with college football these days, it's a tough look. If you had collective bargaining, this would have probably been a breach of contract some way, shape, or form. Yet it's something that makes us all go, well, I guess that's just the game, or this is just an issue that we're working through right now. If you think about it, though, it's still a net loss for Bama. Proctor's missing valuable reps. Everybody always talks about the year two jump of like going from year 1 to year 2 camp and what that looks like and how important that is. Like, that's from a maturity standpoint. You've been on campus for a year. You just need those reps. He's got a new offense, obviously, different surroundings, same quarterback, different surroundings. I think trying to get on the same page is pretty valuable right now, and he didn't necessarily get that at the same time. But I just can't imagine that Caden Proctor has a whole lot of people in his corner outside of the state of Alabama.
This sounds kind of like whatever or jaded, but this one doesn't really affect me because, like, unfortunately, you got to know who you are. And I think Iowa has proven that they are not as, trying to think how to say this diplomatically, not as committed to unturning every stone to be effective in the way that some SEC teams are, or most SEC teams are. I like to imagine Iowa as a team comprised of chunky cats, and the best ones are kind of like Rudy, who can go maybe chase a bird every once in there. So it's so funny to me that they were like, oh, whoops, we cheated. Sorry, our bad. And then Alabama was like, oh, brother, if you think that's bad, we've got to show you. And so, yeah, I think that's just a team kind of punching a little bit above their weight. I don't really fault Proctor for looking at his back home Iowa team and saying, maybe I do want to go home and be one of the chubby cats, Tristan Wirfs. But point being, I think that it was just kind of both sides getting as far as they could. For Iowa, it was self-reporting a violation and then losing him again. For Alabama, it was like, hey, we're still Alabama, brother. Like, let's be real. We're not losing a tackle to Iowa. Yeah, Nick Saban leaving gave you a little bit of a head start, but now we got the people in here. We're going to get this back. So, yeah, I'm not mad at the kid. I think he just wants to play in the pros.
Wait till he gets beat off the edge. Wait till he gets beat off the edge this year, and it won't just be Iowa fans who are clipping it and making sure that it's well known if he has any sort of struggles, and that's more so the point. And just the fluidity of this sport is just so difficult to be able to track. So yeah, he's not the most egregious villain in college football, but there are probably a lot of people that would like to see him struggle. It's the same way that you talk about, like, the kid who ends up being committed to a bunch of different schools, and a guy that I could have put on this list, but I didn't because I thought it was a little bit too specific to one fan base. Donovan Raiola. That's Dylan Raiola. Dylan Raiola, not Donovan, by the way. I don't know why I said his dad's name.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, there's a Damien as well, which is very confusing. But point being, like, that, I think that's a good one because I'm more against Raiola than I would be Proctor because he just left and went to Nebraska, which I know his dad, they have the connection and everything, but that would felt a lot more businessy than Proctor being like, I want to go, oh, just kidding. And like, there was at least kind of a thought there for Proctor, whereas Raiola just fully pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. So I think that the average, like me as an LSU fan, I'm like, what Nebraska and what Raiola did was sketchy to me. I don't know.
Yeah. The Raiola thing is interesting too, just because, like, all right, he's originally committed to Ohio State, then he's committed to Georgia, and now he's committed to Nebraska. And how many fan bases truly feel like slighted because of him and are rooting against him? Whereas I think there are some, maybe more so on the national side, who would look at him having success at Nebraska, like if he leads them to a bowl game, which they have not been to since 2016.
Correct.
Nebraska has not been to a bowl game since 2016. If he does that as a true freshman, I think there will be a lot of people saying like, oh, it's a feel-good story and like, future's bright, all those different things. But again, that's kind of a little bit more up for interpretation. We'll wait and see if he has more comments, more poems in the future that upset people. Like,
the poem really put it over the edge. Thank you for that. There was another thing I was missing. The poem was like, all right, buddy.
Yeah. I don't know that his approval rating did not climb with the poem. We can say that safely. Okay, obvious one here, but let's add the current context to it. The NCAA is a villain until further notice, but it's more of a villain role now because even though it's being reduced to nothing as an organization in college football, cases like Proctor are still kind of a reason to drag the NCAA. Like, every wild case of NIL or tampering, which is about to happen again in a major way. Let's all get ready for this. We're still going to go back to crapping on the NCAA because that's the thing that we can always blame. It's always there. It's all, once we get past the, hey, it's, we didn't have enough money in the collective to be able to get this guy or that guy. It's like, oh, well, it's the NCAA's fault for having interim policies and not being able to restrict some of this stuff. Like, if your team loses the best player on your team in this post-spring window or something like that happens, yeah, you're going to be frustrated with certain NIL opportunities, but you're also still going to be frustrated at the NCAA. The NCAA getting in front of a federal judge and begging for leniency with a one-of-one business model makes them the bad guy, and having a system that it was too competent and not self-aware enough to actually govern also makes them the bad guy. So they just can't win. They cannot win. There are no dubs left for the NCAA. So this is obvious. Like, nothing unites college football fans like the hatred of the NCAA with any case that pops up. It can be a Tez Walker case that happens, like last year when the UNC receiver couldn't be ruled eligible. And that's a month of just dragging the NCAA, and everybody's on board with that. So it's a lazy pick, I admit, to include them on this list, but there's always current context with the NCAA to make them a villain.
Yeah, one of my favorite games I play with one of my friends, and we started this during COVID where it was a lot more applicable, but who is worse at their jobs, the federal government or the NCAA? And it was a really back and forth series there during COVID, but The NCAA, I think, is pulled away. Even if you're the biggest hater you want to be, the NCAA is effectively terrible at everything. You can't put it to be one thing the NCAA does well that you could say, oh, Will Ogden or Connor O'Gara could not do better. It's like when we joke about being an offensive coordinator. Either of us, I think, could at least get one or two agenda items passed as the president of the NCAA that would help somebody. And they just get worse every year. And then when things are hard, they just look at it and go, well, buddy, what do you want us to do? It's like when you're fighting with random individual players and institutions that you're supposed to be representing, maybe spend some of that time helping those people. Yes, correct. Good call.
March Madness is cool.
Yeah.
That's NCAA. Although they weren't letting the women use March Madness because it was trademarked up until like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
March Madness is great. Not
the men's March Madness bracket.
The men's March Madness. Not sexist at all from the NCAA. They're mostly good at putting on the lower revenue championships.
Mm-hmm.
NCAA track and field championships, I think, don't get dragged. College World Series, mostly a successful event. I know there was a lot of talk about the ballpark and stuff like that about 10 years ago, but other than that, but as it relates to college football, you're right. They seemingly cannot do anything right, and they will always be a villain. There is no spin zone left for the NCAA as it currently stands in college football. Similar vein, but different. The 2024 College Football Playoff Selection Committee. I think the vast majority of the 14 playoff era, unpopular opinion, the selection committee got most of it right. I think that's the case. Did they contradict themselves many times and lack common sense during those ranking shows that we watched, and we had to listen to these dumb comments from chairmen that would get up there and spew nonsense and pretend it actually mattered? Yes, they did that. But I could probably count the number of times on one hand that I wholeheartedly disagreed with a team getting into or left out of the playoff. And that's ultimately their only purpose, is to do that. Like last year's Florida State, 2016 Penn State, those were the most egregious for me. I wasn't as opposed to 2014 Ohio State, 2017 Bama as many others were. So I'm acknowledging that I'm a little bit different, and many more people would point that out. I probably would also say 2020 Notre Dame. I didn't like that inclusion over A&M after Notre Dame just got smoked by Clemson in the rematch in the ACC championship when they were in the ACC that lone year. But other than that, I think for the most part, it's been fine. It's also fine when it's 4 teams, and that job is relatively easy with all the different data points that you have by the end of conference championship weekend. With 12, the selection committee is going to get skewered on a weekly basis, and I'm here for it. It's going to be bad. And there are going to be so many different things. Think about how we talk about March Madness with the bid stealers and stuff and net ranking, and we're getting into the weeds with some of these teams and the quad 1 wins and how many quad 3 losses did this team have? It will be like that very soon in college football. And not to that degree, obviously, but if we are thinking that this is just going to be the same as it was with the 14 playoff, it is not, because there are so many more teams involved. And here's the other thing that's worth remembering as we talk about some of these arguments. With ESPN controlling the playoff, but no longer having Big Ten broadcasting rights, you're about to hear so many more arguments about why Big Ten teams are getting shafted and why this is just, I'm telling you now, the biases will be argued for and against in ways that we have never seen this sport. And that makes me nauseous because I hate that stuff. I hate it. Even though the ACC, Big 12, they're still in lockstep with ESPN, the SEC contract beginning in its current form in 2024 with Texas and Oklahoma, that is going to be highly discussed on the outside, not on those ranking shows, but on the outside, scrutinizing these rankings. And there are going to be a lot of people that are upset with every single playoff show. You know who these people are. Spend any time watching ESPN right now, and you'll see a commercial about the SEC ESPN partnership that's beginning next year. Okay. You can probably watch one of these ranking shows and see that. Like that's going to be part of it. It is very difficult to separate that. And anytime there is any SEC team that isn't undefeated and in a path to win a national championship or something like that, that ranking is going to get scrutinized. It just will. That part of it is worth remembering with the selection committee and why they are about to be put in a very bright spotlight in ways that, look, I don't always think they have been throughout this entire process, where there have been years in which we have just known going into Selection Sunday who the Final Four are. Much different when you have 3 times as many teams.
Yes. Man, just so much to dig into here. It's tough because they like to do this little shell game where like, oh, the committee that left out, this team in 2014 or the 2 Big 12 teams in 2014 is not the committee that did this. Say, oh, well, Ohio State lost their first and second string quarterback and we're playing with their third string quarterback, but they hopped those 2 teams. But that's not the same committee as the one, because I've never even, this is probably on me, I've never thought to compare Ohio State to FSU in that way. And it's like, but there's a different committee. So it really doesn't matter, because in the same way that they could say, oh, well, we've set this precedent, they could also say, well, that was a different committee. I don't have anything to do with that. I wasn't in that room. So it's a beautiful shell game for them. I think that, as we continue to expand this stuff, I think we take less and less power out of their hands. It's going to be a lot harder for me to get really, jazzed up about, like one of Mullen's 2 lost Florida teams missing out or whatever versus like, oh, an undefeated FSU, because it's like, I mean, there was something I saw the other day from one of the Instagram accounts I follow that was talking about the expansion to like 16, like whatever the new is, it 14 or 16 they're discussing now.
It's going to be to 14 in 2026.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And but I think they were even discussing past that. Like I saw a couple of new, right? So like they were talking about, okay, here are some teams that would have made it in this thing, and it's like, yeah, none of those teams played even well against like the best teams. And so you will almost catch me 0 times being mad that team that I had 13th, even if that team's LSU, because I was not the guy saying this LSU team needs to see a postseason. It was, please put me out of my misery. This Tanner Mordecai is carving us up. I do not want to see this.
But here's the thing. We can say this now, but it's not so much that you feel like your team isn't worthy of that, or that team X isn't worthy. It's that the other team that gets you fired up. Like when I was getting into the Ole Miss Penn State thing, an argument that I kept having over and over of like, why is the selection committee doing this? Why do they continue to give Penn State the love over Ole Miss? And then, as fate have it, they got to play in a New Year's Six Bowl, and one team was very much better than the other. You know how that went. But these arguments, we can tell ourselves, oh, well, it's not really worth getting into it with the 12 and the 13. But then we realize, you know what? We've adjusted our expectations. And maybe it's 1 year in which the 8 or the 9 seed wins a national championship. And then so we mentally adjust and say, well, man, if that team just gets into the field, if look out, that 2 or 3 loss team, you just never know. And then you find yourself banging the drum for them at the end of the year and why this team isn't worthy and that team is. We will do this. I would love to sit here and say that 4 or 5 years from now, I will not get fired up about the second to last team that's in a 12 team or 14 team field. But I know myself, and I know myself on Selection Sunday when I've had examples of, man, I can't believe this team got left out of the field. It's like, well, they lost to Bryant by 20 in February. Maybe they weren't worthy of playing for a national championship, but it's what we do. We move the goalposts, and we will do that starting this year.
Yeah, and I'll say that, and like seriously, assuming we'll still be doing the podcast when that time comes next year, like you can definitely hold me accountable to that, because I am a big believer in like, yeah, the bubble talk can be fun, but like fun stat, 8 is the lowest NCAA seed to win a championship. It was Villanova in '85. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 11 seeds that made the Final Four. So in this format, that would be like not even making the championship game. So like that's kind of my thing, is that like I've always thought about the bubble. These are just teams who are eventually going to get cut down. Which even last year, in such a weird year where you had your Florida Atlantics, this random stuff happened, still was kind of the cream that rose to the crop, because basketball is such a random sport. Football is even more talent oriented. Okay, you got to have 6'8" dudes that can push forward to win more than 2 or 3. But yeah, we've seen a Cinderella. UCF beat Auburn, but that team I don't think could have won 2 and 3 more games in football, right? In basketball, it's easier. So that's my thing, is that like the contenders that are getting left out, I just even think are going to be less, because yeah, you could point to, like you said, okay, Ohio State, Bama. The reason you like those teams is because of the talent on the roster. If there's a team like that, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that's the difference in the teams that you liked and you didn't like, right?
Yeah, I get that.
Hmm.
I think you're right, and I would love to think that level-headedness would prevail, and we would all be able to say this team wouldn't have a chance to be able to win a title. Actually, Lauren asked me the other day before filling out her bracket, "What's the lowest seed that's ever won a national championship?" I was like, "I think it's that Villanova team. It was like
Hmm.
8 seed or something like that." Yeah, but um, I just know that college football fans will adjust, and anything that can be seen as a slight is going to come back to the selection committee. So
Yeah.
there's no patting on the back. There will be absolutely none of that in the 12 team era. It will
Yep.
be who has slighted my team, where are the media rights tied to, and how can we find a way to pin our team's 2 or 3 loss season on one group that is making this decision.
Yes, and I'm going to say one thing and then transition to a question, and then we can move on. But the one thing I worry about with the 14 playoff, and again, like again, I've made my peace with the 12. It's that there might have been truly championship level teams that were left out, right? And that's why, okay, with the 12, I don't really see that being as big of a problem. So this brings me to the second time this person has been mentioned on this list, and why I think we at least have to consider them. Herb Street is getting there, I think.
Herbstreit is nearing villain territory if he continues to stay online.
Yep.
If he continues to stay
Stop
online,
posting.
just stop.
Never
Don't
post. Best advice.
don't slide into people's DMs that have a much smaller voice than you
Yep.
and try and get into this back and forth. It's not worth it. You're not helping your cause. I think that there are moments in which I question that with Herb Street, and I think you could probably say like McAfee could be thrown into this category, but I don't know that he's so much a villain of
He's
college
polarizing.
football. Yeah, he's polarizing, and people kind of like dislike him. Like Corso's not a villain in a way because like you could say he's past his prime. He shouldn't be on the air. You're not like he doesn't care. He doesn't have these villainous characteristics. Now, when McAfee goes on there and he's like sitting there just like trying to blast Georgia fans on game day and he's
Yeah.
saying like, oh, you guys wanted Pollock and blah, blah, blah. Then he leans into that. And there's the WWE side of McAfee that
Yeah.
is, we just kind of assume that with him though.
Yeah,
So
he's a character. He's fully a character. Whereas the reason why we get some people and like Paul Feinbaum can do a little bit of this too or whatever. Like, well, he'll say, "Okay, I'm a serious journalist. I'm here to present the facts," and then he'll let Tammy from wherever go off for 30 minutes about how Tennessee's overrated, and he just goes, "Uh huh." So like same deal with McAfee or with Kirk, where it's like his whole thing is, "I am this objective great journalist," which we've agreed he's amazing at that job. It's exactly what you just said: the posting, the Raiola thing, the FSU thing, the partnership with ESPN, where people are starting to believe that there's this shadow puppet situation going on. He's not doing enough to kind of push back on that. So yeah, I think at his job, he's great. It's just the off the cuff stuff.
I have Cannell, and I was going to ask you about Feinbaum. I have Cannell
Mm-hmm.
on this list just
Mm-hmm.
because there's probably a line between troll and villain
Yep.
that he walks very much. But if Herb Street leans into more of the Cannell side,
Yep.
that's when he becomes a villain. Like DK is he's a really good dude. Like
Yeah.
ask anybody that spent any time around him, and he's like a really nice, like down to earth guy. Like national championship 2 years ago, I talked to him more than I ever have, and he Barrett Salee and I had just a great time. Like before, after, during that game, like just shooting the breeze on a variety of topics, and
Mm-hmm.
like I truly like Danny. I really, really do. I hate his online persona. I
Yep.
think he lives to troll, and I think he knows he lives to troll. Like if you listen to Danny on a radio show, you're like, oh, that's very different. I wouldn't really match those two up with the Twitter profile. If Herb Street leans into that and is
Yep.
willing to do that, that shows you that he is somewhat indifferent about becoming a villain of college football. And you're right, he is approaching that in ways that, look, I think Feinbaum leans into it a bit more. It's different when you have a conference affiliation or something like that. I don't know that people will sometimes look at Paul more so in the way that they look at McAfee, like he is a character more so than a villain. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he can troll from time to time here and there, but maybe even Paul is kind of taking a backseat to that because Paul doesn't have Saban, he doesn't have Harbaugh in the sport anymore. Like,
Yeah.
is he running out of people to be able to like just like try and dunk on? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the media conversation of like what's a troll, what's a pundit, what's a villain is a very difficult thing to kind of differentiate. And
Yeah.
it's tough to kind of sometimes separate those things. But yeah, I like that question about Herbstreit, because I would have never ever answered that a year ago. But I think the last year
Ever.
has changed that.
And I think it's conscious. And to your point about Cannell, like I saw a tweet that he had, I think it was yesterday, about like, oh well, imagine if the ACC had gotten like the SEC treatment in the tournament, and it's like, buddy, your alma mater is trying to leave that conference. Which agenda are you pushing here? That the
Shameless plug for later.
ACC,
Yeah, yeah.
no, literally, like that's what we're talking about on this episode. Is like, yo, Danny Cannell, why are you pushing that the ACC deserves more respect if your team is actively saying we don't respect you? Let's get out of here. So like that to me is a take artist, and I respect it. To be clear, I fully respect it. I get the game, but you're that is an unserious opinion. You're doing that for clicks, and like in a way that I think, and we'll move on after this. Like it feels like Kirk is trying to get up there and have real, honest conversations with people. I'm like, buddy, like this is not the place for that. Like these people are going to keep going at you and keep trying to get under your skin, and there's nothing you can say that will help where you're at right now. Like he's trying to have like a heart to heart on Twitter. Twitter is not the place to have heart to heart.
Herbstreit is a people pleaser.
Yes.
He is a people pleaser. That could prevent him from being a true villain. But at his core, whether he admits that publicly or not, he is a people pleaser. And sometimes I feel like he loses sight of that at times, or doesn't realize that until it's a little bit too late. And he's voicing his opinion because that's what he's paid to do. But then sometimes you see these comments, you're like, well, that's like the words of a villain. That's not the words of like a level-headed analyst that you are paid to be. But yeah, those questions are definitely worth having at this point.
That's
Okay.
such a great note. I'm sorry. That's such a great note, because everything that he has done that people would say is like wrong could be viewed as, okay, he's having this conversation with Barilla. He's just trying to help dude out and say, I agree with your decision. Do whatever you feel is right. And, in his mind. And then it comes out as he's pushing him towards Nebraska. Okay, he's trying to have an open and honest conversation with FSU fans and trying to explain his own actions to try to bridge that gap. But then it makes him look like a hypocrite because he's on TV saying this and he's on Twitter saying this. So you're right. I don't think he's poking the bear. I think he's trying to be a good dude and what's the word? And kind of tell people, okay, well, this is really why I'm a normal guy. This is why it's normal. And people are not digging that. And in reality, it would be better to just not engage and move on to the next point. So actually, it's a really good point. He's actually going out of himself to try to be a good guy. That's what's hurting him.
I think if you're going to be a villain at any level, you have to be okay with others not liking you.
Yep.
Sometimes you lean into that more than others, but there is a certain indifference about whether or not people like you, or maybe you prefer that people don't like you and that they fear you. Greg Sankey is a worthy inclusion on this list. I think Sankey, in the minds of some, not all, but in the minds of some, has shifted from consensus voice of reason to villain. Not in the SEC, but I think the vast majority of college football fans, and now college basketball fans, after his comments to Pete Thamel about giving away opportunities for Power 5 conferences to automatic qualifiers for smaller schools, like all that stuff. Sankey's approval rating nationally, not great right now. Not great. He's in control and at the center of these big, big decisions for the future of big revenue college athletics. It's not just that he bangs the drum for the strength of the ICC when he's talking about playoff spots and he's like, one of these things is not like the other. It's not just that. It's the fact that there is a world in which a premier league for college football could eventually exist. And it feels like if it will exist, it'll be in part because of Sankey's doing. I've often thought to myself over the course of the last few weeks, few months, what does Greg Sankey want? What is Greg Sankey's end game in college athletics? Is it simply to do right by the ADs and the presidents that he works for and to get the most money humanly possible into their pockets so that we can fund this new era of college athletics? Is that simply what is motivating all of his decisions? Or is it he wants to truly see college athletics thrive and have somewhat of an even playing field and have somewhat of a stage in which the SEC can still benefit more than anybody else from that even playing field? I think those are two different things. And I think sometimes it looks like he acts in the interest of both of those things. He can really play it however he wants, and he can say that he's going to act in the best interest for the future of college football. But I'm not sure he'll truly get to make that claim moving forward when we see more clearly than ever, even more clearly than right now, that all of these decisions are just for money. It's like when a politician wants to claim that they want to do right by an area that it serves, when in
Yep.
reality, it wants to do right by its donors and get reelected to be able to maintain power. And that's like what this comes down to.
Yep.
I'm not saying Sankey is like full politician, but there is an element to it that makes him a bit more polarizing because of the control that he has. Whereas if he's just Tony Petitti, who's been very much in the shadows, but now that Sankey is the elder statesman among core four commissioners, that's what we're calling it. I
Mm-hmm.
think it puts him in a little bit of a different light, and one that I'm not sure that we have really ever had in college sports entering what could be this new era.
Yeah, he's interesting to me because I do feel like he splits the middle a little bit, which is okay. If he were fully just out for himself, I mean, we now know that these other schools, right, Washington, Oregon, the two LA schools, were open for business. Why would they join the Big Ten over the SEC? To me, there's no. If you guys are still pretending to care about academics, then I mean, you let Nebraska in. So, like, I like to me, I think that if he was truly this money hungry ghoul that people outside the SEC try to turn him into, I just think he would handle things a lot differently. I mean, the schools he added, Texas and Oklahoma, have had eyes on the SEC for years, especially if you talk to their fans. They've not had these historic conferences. You're talking about the Big Eight, Southwest, going back and forth and not being in the same conference. So I know the Big 12, which started off with 12 teams, was their home for our lives, but I do think there's not this history there that some would say. Whereas when you talk about USC, right, Pac-12, right, when you think about Washington, when you think about even Oregon, Pac-12, but Pac-10, right? So to me, the most, and this dovetails back around to the thing I say all the time, which is your character is shown when you don't have all the cards, right? So for Sankey, he's shown that money is not the number one object to him, or would grab those other schools and crush the Big Ten. And the Big Ten would have no agency in these decisions whatsoever because they already have the top, whatever, and get into that. But the guy that's interesting to me is new Big 12 commissioner, Brett Yormark, right? Because he has had to play with the deck loaded against him the entire time. You've seen how he's handled expansion. You've seen how he's rebranded the Big 12 as a basketball conference. So to me, I think that it's hard to look at Sankey and say, you represent evil, you represent money, when the other commissioners are more looking out for their conference than even he is, and he has an eye towards the future of the sport. Because when he comes out and says maybe there'll be a super league, it's a complete distrust. And then in the NCAA, which we all feel, right? It's I don't trust you guys to keep this thing afloat for obvious reasons. I'm just letting you know if it keeps handling this way, I'm out of here, which I think is great for everyone because that at least gives them some impetus to get their stuff together.
I think that there is a feeling though that if we do get to a Premier League eventually, and if that again, that's not what I am assuming is going to happen, but if
Mm-hmm.
that feared result happens, it's not going to be Brett Yormark that's leading the charge. It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
Sankey.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be Sankey, and if you're the face of the person who does that, you get hate in ways that you don't just acting
Mm-hmm.
as the commissioner of your specific league. I mean, think
Yeah.
about in pro sports when a commissioner is on the job for a strike or something like that, or there's a steroid crisis like what Bud Selig had to deal with, or there's broadcasting rights like Gary Bettman had to deal with in the NHL and brought upon himself. Like it comes back to the person that is most visible. I think what was the phrase that Pete Thamel used in that story? It was like I want to say what did he said it was like the bulldog, like a bulldog of expansion. Like but essentially the person that is driving this and that is
Yeah.
looking out and having these conversations, whereas everyone else it feels like is kind of looking out for their own conference and their own best interests, and Sankey is kind of saying, well, hey, this is what the power conferences need to be able to do, this is how the NCAA tournament should do moving forward. When you take that on,
Mm-hmm.
you open yourself up, and it's not just simply, oh, are you the commissioner that's navigating a way to play through the pandemic or something like that,
Yeah.
or are you getting the richest contract and we're patting you on the back like you're Jim Delaney, former Big Ten commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
There are different things that he is setting himself up for to be the face of what college football fans view as wrong about the new era of the sport. And I think that is why he has become more of a villain than a savior in the eyes of many.
Yes, and I fully see what you're saying. I will say this though, part of that is because closet Pittsburgh Steelers fan Kevin Warren is now onto his next job. right? So I think he was the one that started the mess. He moved into his next role. It was 2 commissioners at the top, and then Sankey is the only one sitting there going, okay, like you said, you got this new cat at the Big Ten who it's like, what do you do? You're behind the scenes. We don't really see you. Like, da da da. So it's like, here's the sport. It's kind of on this weird track where it's like kind of descending into chaos. He's the only guy in the room with a voice that's been there, that's done it before. To your point about, yeah, you're right. Your marker's doing that to thrive or to survive. We talked about a guy from the Pac-12 who drove his conference into the ground, right? Like, I think that he is doing what the sport needs, which is to have some unified voice, because the other dudes there just aren't quite built for it. They don't have that same tenure. They haven't been around big college athletics the way that he has. So, yeah, I think that if you ask him, he would like everything to work out well. He would like for the SEC to continue whooping everyone, and he would like the sport to stay pretty similar to what it was, because none of these guys like the transfer portal. So I think that how would the sport be different if Kevin Warren were still here? I think it would be more of like a back and forth between those two where they reach an agreement versus like, well, it's just Sankey. He's the elder statesman, like you said.
I don't really trust Kevin Warren to do much of anything, especially as a Bears fan.
Right.
Don't really have a whole lot of faith in him. Think Sankey would still be driving those conversations, or at least making the significant decisions, the most important voice in that room. But when you are the face of an organization that is doing things that very clearly are being done for money, then people are going to hate on you in ways that, look, I think it's just different. That you can get into the subject of amateurism and all that other stuff if you want, but I think that's going to be the target of the vitriol that he's going to face in the coming era of college athletics. Actual football villain. Colorado? Do we think Colorado? Look, I'm not saying everyone hates Colorado. I don't hate Colorado. Plenty of people were all aboard that bandwagon last year, and understandably so, with the start that they got off to. ESPN went to a Colorado State-Colorado game in September. All right. That was College game day, and a game in which ends up being a lot more thrilling than what it was originally supposed to be, but probably a sign that this Colorado team was not as good as the start that it got off to. But again, a villain is the group that non-rivals love to actively root against. And in 2024, I think Colorado has offered up plenty of ammo for that. There was a USA Today story like a couple weeks ago about Deion not doing any in-home or high school visits during his 2 years at Colorado. He offered up like a bit of an explanation on that, saying that he wanted to save Colorado money. Interesting. And it's a scene
something Deion has always cared about, financial frugality.
Yeah, Deion is big on frugality. That is his favorite thing to be able to hang his hat on. He also said, and I agree with this to a certain extent, that it's a scene wherever he goes, which makes some feel special and others feel less special if he doesn't go there. I don't think people like that. Okay, Nick Saban still is in home recruiting. You think Nick Saban isn't special everywhere he goes? Nick Saban has an aura. All right, like this.
He's gonna need to do some in-home recruiting.
Yeah, very much. Wait, are you saying Saban does or Deion?
I said Saban's gonna need to, because you said Saban still does in-home recruiting. I was just kidding, because he's such a great recruiter. Because Saban's such a great recruiter, I was saying he's gonna still need to do in-home recruiting for Alabama. Never mind.
Oh, you're making a joke about Alabama recruiting, even though DeBoer has actually been on a roll lately. So okay, that was a reach. That flew right over my head. So okay, I don't think people like hearing his explanation on stuff like that, and I think people dislike the people who dislike Deion point to thinking that his way is best and that he ignores what works. They don't want to hear that his way is best from a guy who has coached a Power 5 program for 1 year and they won 4 games. And that is kind of the frustration, that he gets so much attention and he is considered this darling by some. And there are others who say, well, why isn't my coach getting that sort of attention? It's like, well, your coach isn't Deion Sanders. That's just the cold hard truth. But I get that. I also agree that there is a different way that Deion has had to go about this job. And so if your entire frustration is, well, he's not doing things the way that Colorado has done them in the past, and therefore that's why he's going to fail, I'd say, well, what's the definition of insanity? Deion is definitely not insane. He's He's doing things in a very unique way at a very unique job, I believe it is. So I think there is still obviously a big target on Colorado. I don't think people like Deion going on $1 million worth of game and saying that, quote, certain cities ain't going to happen. It ain't going to be Eli for the likes of Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. Side note on that, we always call this an Eli. It's an Elway.
Yep.
It's an Elway. It's not an Eli. Yep. It was Elway who refused to play for the Baltimore Colts and threatened to play baseball for the Yankees if they didn't trade him with the number 1 overall pick. Go back and watch Elway to Marino, one of my favorite 30 for 30s. It's been very much on the top of my mind with these rumors that Caleb Williams didn't want to come to Chicago, having people like RG3 come out and say that he should pull an Eli. I'm very biased on that, so I don't want to weigh in. But it's pull an Elway, not pull an Eli. That's a slight issue that I have with Deion saying that. But anyway, with Shedeur, there's a certain level of national skepticism that I think people still have about him because of the NIL opportunities, the last name, all those different things. No idea how much money that guy has actually made in NIL. I'm kind of skeptical of any number that comes out. But the guy's on a bunch of commercials. He still has some work to do as a prospect. His pocket presence and taking all of those hits, if we're just talking about it from a football standpoint, makes you think that this guy still has a ways to be able to go. I think there are people that are actively rooting against him, and they will root against him more if they see him, top 5 in these way too early mock drafts. His smile even is a little bit villainous. He's got a little bit of that look for whatever reason. Like he kind of leans into that. Like you can tell at a press conference sometimes when he says something that he knows comes off really confident. Deion has that too. Like they don't care about that. And that's kind of the thing that makes you a villain. If you don't care that something might upset people and you're just going to say it because that's what you want to do. So I think Colorado is a fair inclusion for the villain category.
This is a fascinating one, right? Like, let me start with this question. Why do you think Deion does those visual or kind of PR things? This is a real question. Do you think it's to promote the Deion Sanders brand, or do you think it's to promote the Colorado brand?
Yes. Yes. I think Deion Sanders is the Colorado brand. And I think that is what he's promoting. It's always been about Deion. We know this. But now that you're associated with the program, yeah, I think there is a self-awareness where that's what I'll give him tremendous credit for. He is Colorado. Like if he walked away from Colorado, but like Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders are still there, the conversations about Colorado are wildly different. They just are. And he knows that. So I don't necessarily I'm not crazy about all of his media moments. If you want to say, but yeah, there's a ton of self-promotion there, no doubt.
Well, you've just brought a point to my mind, which is that they certainly can't fire him this year because just like a divorce, he's taking the kids. He's taking his sons off of that team. They have no quarterback, so he's locked into that job for at least another year.
He's getting at least he's not getting fired within there's no way they're giving him at least 4 years. If they have to make a decision like that.
Yeah, 100%. And so I'll say this with him, right? He's a lot more interesting of a guy than I think I give him credit for. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Ed Millett or his podcast, The Ed Millett Show, but he was on there the other day, and he gave a different profile of a guy than what you've seen. It was, a guy who is very, for lack of a better word, faith, family, football, a guy who does not, do drugs, does not drink, does not curse. I had never realized he's a guy who doesn't curse until I heard him say it. And so it's interesting that Colorado has a certain appeal to, this demographic of America, similar to Georgetown or Miami back in the day, but he actually doesn't have the level of kind of against authority actions other than his words, right? Because he's not out here excusing, certain types of behavior. He's really just trying to be positive, right? So for me, I have always been in line with people that are more of changers of the game, that are innovators, right? We talked about adapt or die. Well, this guy's not doing things the way that other coaches are. Our guy McIntyre got fired for winning lots of games there the right way, right? So I think that kind of shows you what this unique situation he's in, which is that because of some incidents in his past that I've talked about nauseam with Prime Academy, you can look that up, right? But because of his past and because of his demeanor and because of this, right? The real thing about Deion is he is a human being that cannot be controlled, right? Because if you hear him talk, one of my favorite quotes that I will play whenever I'm getting ready for something is Deion saying, I've been him. I've done this. I've been a game changer. I've been this guy. Okay. So you can't take away Deion's playing career. You can't take away the fact that he hit home runs and scored touchdowns in the NFL. And so people's opinion of Deion Sanders does not change that he's the greatest defensive back of all time. Does not change what he's done on air or what he's done, in different things. So that's what's so scary, because he leans so deep into, I don't care what you think of me. He cares what people think of him because he's aware. Exactly what you just said. He sculpts an image to his liking, but he doesn't need to appease anyone to be what he is, to be a good recruiter, to be a guy that people want to come play for. So when people are begging for Deion to get humbled, what they are really pushing for, in my mind, is the old, I want to say meritocracy, but we all know it's not a meritocracy. You know what I'm saying? The old way of taking your lumps, the old way of being humble and putting your head down, right? But that being said, all these great coaches, it's not like they were given. It's very hard to find a Gary Patterson who takes over a situation that's desolate and turns it into something great. Even Nick Saban got to Alabama and had resources there, right? So all these guys that are given all these big turnaround props, it's like, well, yeah, but you really just activated stuff that was already there. Deion's building something from the ground up. Now you could say about the athletes and, Travis Hunter being at this HBCU, was that best for him? Who's to say? It's working out pretty well for him right now. You talk about his son taking all these sacks, exactly what you said. Is that what's best for him? Is that what's best for Deion? Well, it was certainly last year was better for Colorado if you saw how bad that line was, right? At least it's a guy who stayed upright the whole season and was able to stay healthy. So I don't know. I think year 2 through 4, exactly what you just said, is going to show us a lot more. You can get through 1 year off of bravado, and that's pretty much what they did, as you saw how bad they were after that 4-game stretch. But I'm not going to totally cash out the chips on him. And I would say, if you hate Deion, really think about and write down why it is that you hate Deion and what he would need to do to change that.
If he keeps going 4-8, he won't be villain territory. He will be. It'll be like, all right, you haven't done this. You're not worthy of our time to get upset about.
Yep.
Even the people that have banged the drum for you, they still might be. They're still probably in your corner, because I don't know that a whole lot of people have changed their opinion on Deion in the last 30 years. If we're being 100% honest, like, you kind of feel how you feel about him. But at the same time, like, if you go 4-8, 3-9, something like that, and it's like, oh, it's just not really working, it eventually kind of runs its course. Whereas now there is that polarizing, will he win big? Will he not win big? Will he do it his way? Will he have to do it somebody else's way? So there's a little bit more of that intrigue that's there that makes the villain, I think, title a bit more appropriate for where Colorado currently is and where Deion currently is in his coaching career. Question for you. Let's end with this. Let's end with some coaches. What is your take on Brian Kelly and Lincoln Riley being considered villains? Because I am reluctant to say definitively that they are, because I think so much of the hate that they received is tied to two fan bases, two proud fan bases who are lovers scorned. And so when they do anything wrong, those two fan bases are going to be the most vocal. But is there maybe a bit more villainous in them than just simply leaving a particular team? Like, it's one thing to make fun of Brian Kelly's accent or something like that, or make fun of Lincoln Riley's brisket, but I mean, like, a true hatred for what they choose to represent. Do they qualify as villains of college football?
Oh, I love this one. And you know what else? I would also throw a guy that you just came into my mind when you were talking about Dabo. Dabo is a guy that I think that we hated forever because he was winning, and now it feels like, the chickens have come home to roost, and because he's stuck in his ways and not using the church, it's like he's getting justice. I love that you didn't include him, because that goes to show some of these people we hate because they're winning and they're obnoxious about it. That's exactly what he was. Watching, I would rather, if you could guarantee me Dabo was going to be at Clemson and go 8-4 every year, I would love to have Dabo at Clemson. It was when Dabo was threatening to take over Alabama after Nick Saban left. Not threatening, but that was the thought around college football. That was more so the thought of, like, could this actually happen? Yeah, it was a torch, quote unquote, torch passing. When they won the 2 titles, and it was all this. Well, now it's not as scary that he's Mr. Bible thumper. I hate to say it that way, and he's Mr. Old tradition, name, image, likeness of the Lord. That stuff is funny now that he's viewed as not such a winner, right? But to your point, Lincoln Riley is in a similar category. You know what Oklahoma fans call Lincoln Riley?
I think I've seen this before, but remind me.
TBOW, that B word out west.
Yep, I've seen that. Definitely have seen that.
Yep. So to your point, yeah, that's a fan base mad at someone. I personally, I am annoyed by Lincoln Riley because of kind of the way they run that program and always have, the way that they're so arrogant, the way that they attract NBA style players that are a lot more me first and a lot less team oriented, right? I have more of a disrespect for him than I do for Deion Sanders because he is in places that have resources and he's still choosing to be this way, right? Brian Kelly is another one that's funny because he's kind of done the opposite, right? Winning has made people like him a little bit more because they've realized he's going to make them look silly. If Dabo or Lincoln Riley start winning, they're going to be more hated. Brian Kelly, in my opinion, the hatred started to cool off when he started winning, when he beat Alabama, when he won the West, right? Because people realized they were wrong. And you can't just sit there and have Notre Dame accounts retweeting and saying, oh, Brian Kelly typically mad at his players again. And then Jaden Daniels goes out there and scores 3 straight touchdowns and beats Mizzou. You know what I'm saying? So you just look silly when you make fun of Brian Kelly versus if you were sitting there dumping on Lincoln Riley or Dabo the last couple of years, you've looked awesome. And so point being, I think that goes to show, again, how you treat people kind of like when they're down goes to show. So I think people are always going to hate Brian Kelly. I think that's facts. He has, as I've told you, like I literally texted you the other day, I don't factor in how many NFL players Brian Kelly has produced because I pretend they didn't exist because they happened at Notre Dame. And my entire life has been geared to hate Notre Dame, like I talked about earlier. And so I'm sitting there going, oh my God, he has a franchise left tackle. He has these great DBs. He's a safe. When did this happen? Oh, my entire life. I just pretended like it didn't matter. Now that he's my coach, I want to push that agenda. And so point being, we care about what we choose to care about. But I think that when you can take shots at these people, it's fun. When you can take shots at Brian Kelly, but he's done a lot of proving people wrong over the last 2 years. He's won his first Heisman. He's done a lot that people said that couldn't be done for him in the SEC. He's already recruiting at a much higher level than people expected. So it's a lot harder, but I will say that first loss, right? That first moment of struggle, if they lose to USC, suddenly all the Notre Dame accounts are going to be talking because that's the best thing they have going on right now is to quote tweet Brian Kelly. And like you said, is it one fan base or is it everyone? I think most of America is starting to turn on Brian Kelly and think, well, this guy's inevitable. He's kind of like, did I like Nick Saban? I wasn't crazy about him, but he's such a winner that I had to respect him. And that's the territory Brian Kelly is getting in that I feel like Lincoln Riley is almost devoid of, right? That Lincoln Riley would have to win 2 or 3 titles before I respected him.
I think what's undeniable, and I guess maybe it could be denied because I don't really have the numbers to prove this. But when they lose or when they do something wrong, Deion, Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley are your 3 leaders in the clubhouse of people that are going to get the most national hate. That is reality. Like if Saban loses a game in a season, it used to be like, well, it was more about like what the other team did so much because you're not going to sit here and dog a guy with that many rings. Kirby has kind of reached that place too. It's not like you're sitting here just dragging Kirby for losing a game to Alabama in the SEC championship. So like there's a certain level, and I guess Dabo is kind of part of it. But again, like you said, him kind of falling off of this national stage doesn't make it quite at that same level that it once was. So yeah, I mean, I think those 3 are the leaders in the clubhouse of the pile on group of villain that is just like, oh man, it's just easy to be able to take shots at them for very different reasons. The coaches who wish they were villains but really aren't, Drink and Pat Narduzzi. Those guys. Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, they lean into that. The quotes of like, I don't care, how this comes across. I'm almost saying this to be a heel, that type of thing. Probably got to have more prolonged success to be considered a true villain, more so than like an annoyance. And oh God, like this guy again, I got to deal with this. I don't want to say fly in the ointment and set a picnic, but probably more that than villain at this stage of the game. Who knows? If Drink keeps winning and he wants to show up and, may the force be with you. If he wants to lean into that, like literally the guy showed up as a villain at a post-game press conference. Yeah, that conversation changes. But as it relates to 2024, I think they're probably more on the outside looking in very desperately.
I think there's a couple of other additions to this list. I love that. Drink is, and I like Drink a lot. We talked about this. I think he's enough of a goober to where your goober contingent, like me, is always going to like him. Like it feels like he did the meme where he's pointing at himself in the mirror and being like, you go be a villain today. And I love that, because we all got to hype ourselves up. I think there are some other guys that could move into that. One that's really interesting to me, and just really think about if the world was, if things were different, they'd be different, as I always say. If Billy Napier were winning at Florida, he would be a villain.
I don't know that he'd be a villain. I disagree.
The things that are funny to us now, if they were winning, they would be annoying. The game changer coordinators, it would be similar to Dabo, right? But because they are losing and how they are losing, it is funny. It is not. It doesn't make me angry.
See, but the difference between Billy and Dabo, even though obviously the connection of being in the Dabo tree and being fired as Dabo's OC, Billy's not evangelical. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that the right way to say that? Like, he's not so much, and I'm not talking about from like a religious, like an actual religious standpoint. I'm just saying like the way that he presents himself to the world. There's a little bit more of a quiet confidence to Billy that Dabo is not necessarily on board with, because Dabo at this stage of his career, quite frankly, doesn't have to be. He's won multiple championships. I don't think Billy would fall into that, because I don't think he would lean into it. I think he would, like, you can make fun of, because you're an LSU fan, you're very biased in this conversation. Like, this is you're very biased in this conversation of whether or not the Florida coach is going to be hated, because
Lane Kiffin's cool. I only didn't like Lane Kiffin when he was a loser. Now that he looks like he's winning stuff, I think he's awesome.
You think an Ole Miss coach is the same to you as a Florida coach? Come on.
Okay, this is actually a good point I started to bring up earlier. It's different for different generations of fans. If I talk to people my mom's age, I said I like Lane Kiffin, they would say, that's the Ole Miss coach. You can't like. I mean, that was LSU. The Magnolia Bowl was their biggest rivalry. To me, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I didn't hate Hugh Freeze as much as, so it's all relative to me, but I view, DeBoer doesn't even bother, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's all about people. So in my opinion, I think Napier is in his all shucks era right now, but I think that if he progresses past that, it's going to be different. If you look at some of the little things he's doing, because Dabo was no shucks guy. I was just a receivers coach. I got this job by the grace of God. And then he started winning, and then it became a problem.
I would need to see multiple years of success and how Billy handles that for me to even think about that. Because right now, like that is so off my radar as a guy, like, because it's our job to sit here and say, why are you hiring this in-game coordinator? Or why are you hiring this special teams coach, or not hiring this special teams coach? Like I think there's a difference between a guy that can be clowned on versus a guy that can be considered a villain. And Billy is more the former than the latter at this stage of his career.
Yes, and I'll say this too. One guy from each category, right? Where do you have James Franklin in here?
I tried not to let my annoyance of James Franklin make him become the villain. So he's a villain for some Penn State fans. He is. I don't know that James Franklin does enough that upsets the masses to make him a true villain. And I think that James Franklin has a little bit of that behind closed doors. I need to be well liked. I need to have the positive PR spin about me. I think he has that a little bit too much to truly be a villain, to truly have this, like, yeah, I don't care. No, it's angling for the next contract. It's making sure that this late decision that ultimately costs his team a chance to beat a quality team doesn't come back to him. The lack of accountability. I don't know that he embraces that so much. And I'm more so annoyed by the way that James Franklin comes off than I think he is like truly a villain, a guy that wants you to dislike him and you truly dislike him.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to how you handle missteps and bad things too. So for him, his quote about it's like I'm speaking Japanese this year threw me over the edge. I was like, this is an obvious problem that we all see. We're literally trying to give you creative feedback, which is, hey, maybe throw the ball sometimes. And he's sitting there going, I know so much more than you about football. Shut up. And it's like, yeah, dude, this is why you'll never beat Michigan and Ohio State, because you think you know more than them.
Yeah. I don't know that I always put the person who thinks they're the smartest in the room in that category. I strongly dislike the person, that person.
Yep.
And the person that can never apologize. Think of the last time in your life that you said the words, I'm sorry. If you can't remember that, that's on you.
Yep.
Because we all mess up. But James Franklin is more so that to me than he is like, oh, I'm like unapologetically this brash, bold personality that I don't care. Like, I'm going to do things my way. Like, Dion is way, way more out there in that way. Whereas James Franklin is like, there's a little bit too much of the woe is me. Like, the thing that always annoyed me about him is like when he's getting up there and he's complaining about negative recruiting at Big Ten Media Days. And he's talking about, well, Notre Dame and Ohio State and Michigan are saying that we're going to have a bowl ban for this, this, and this. And it's like, buddy, you've had the job now for how many years? 3, 4 years, and you're still trying to come up with stuff like that. And it just comes off as like excuses constantly. So I don't really know so much that fits into that type of box. But maybe he's a villain. He could be a villain for some people, and probably Penn State fans who have had to watch his late game management.
Yeah, that's a good point. If the fan base is united with you, it feels more like I could never be mad at Iowa because I feel like their fans are suffering as much as I am watching them. They are not willful. They are not co-conspirators with what's going on at Iowa, which is similar for Penn State. Sorry, I just thought of one more, so 2 more. One that I got to include, if I'm going to include Billy Beamer. I think people hate Beamer, and I love Beamer. We've talked about this, but I think it goes into be humble. Same as Dion in the way, right? You're not supposed to celebrate your losses. You're not supposed to celebrate your wins if your losses are right there. And for him, every win's a celebration. Every loss is sad. People don't like to see that.
Yeah, I think Beamer would embrace a villain role if he got to that place.
That exactly what. Yep.
Yeah, I think he would be perfectly fine with that. Like there is a certain level of chip that one must have on their shoulder. And people could say, well, he's only had this job because of nepotism, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I would push back on the notion that he's only a core 4 coach because of nepotism. That's not really the way that it works anymore. But like, I think that if he got to that place where it was like 10-win season, 10-win season, 10-win season, he would lean into that. I don't think everybody would. I think he definitely would. And it would be, I'm here. This is how I need to be able to operate. I'm going to talk trash. I don't care if I upset this opposing coach or that opposing coach. I'll do the post-game trolling and stuff like that.
Yep.
Yeah, so again, it takes success. It takes more notoriety as he currently stands. Where the program currently stands, is he enough to be considered a villain? I would say not yet.
Yeah, I'm projecting where villains were early in their career when they had to be humble, right? Talking about Dabo, projecting where some guys that look this way went, right? This fits in great with the quote you just said. One guy that I think will be viewed this way going forward, Chip Kelly.
I almost included him on this list and I didn't. I almost did. I think there is you talk about being humbled and how sometimes that can take the edge off of how you're perceived nationally. In a way, Chip Kelly was humbled. Now, you could say he was a lame duck coach at UCLA. He had an AD that should have fired him at the end of the regular season. That didn't happen. That ultimately led to him leaving. But a coach of a Core 4 program, I'm really trying to make Core 4 happen. Please be on board with this, everybody that's listening to this. Let's lean into Core 4.
I'm down, yeah.
I think there's a certain humbleness that people don't really hate. That he said, look, I'm not getting it done here. I don't think I have a path to victory in this current setup. I'm just going to go to Ohio State. I'm just going to go do this job and be a ball coach, and I'm over this NIL stuff. He had the rants about, how like I could fix college sports. This is what I could do. How much did he steal from our guy Sean Merriman? I'm just saying, Brett Merriman, not Sean Merriman. Sean Merriman was the NFL player.
I was like, I don't know what Sean Merriman said, but it sounded good.
Sorry, my guy Brett. My bad. But like, I don't know that Chip truly fits into that. I don't think Chip has a particularly high approval rating, though. So that definitely aligns with villain status. And I'm just going to say whatever I want all the time. And like former players at the NFL level certainly didn't seem to be his biggest fans. He's not a people person through and through. He's close, but I think almost the move to Ohio State kind of takes some of that villainness away from him. Or you could just look at the uniform combined with Chip Kelly and say, yeah, that probably qualifies as a villain.
So I'm so interested by this because I think he is a guy who in the aggregate can actually get enough people angry that it actually works out. So if you think about it like this, Oregon fans probably don't like him anymore because he went to the Pac-12 to go coach for a rival. You could talk about what they had going on, but Mario, that wasn't great, right? So that you left to go coach for a rival school, like we just talked about with ETN. If we're going to hold players that standard, same deal here. Eagles fans despise this man. So that's, one of the biggest NFL fan bases across the country. That's all dang near all of Pennsylvania. They despise this man. UCLA fans and players, right? If you're talking about leaving a team behind, he definitely did that. And then you can go back to his Oregon days and think about traditionalists and think about way back to, okay, even Auburn playing him in the championship, LSU playing him with the sissy blue jerseys, as Coach O said, right? Like the way that he has represented kind of smarter than you, plus like newfangled jerseys, all that different stuff. Like ask Alabama fans what they think of Chip Kelly. Probably because of the way he won with the jerseys and I'm smarter than you and all that, they probably don't like him. And then now he's at Ohio State, so who hates him there? Michigan fans. You start to throw stuff in there. You go, okay. And all of the way that he conducted himself every way, he was a jerk. He thought he acted like he was smarter than everyone. He acted like he needed to be the GM, traded franchise cornerstones in Philly. So, like, yeah, I think that as much as some people can be appreciative, I don't think he's done enough winning at any level other than Oregon, who, again, he went to a school that was like technically their rival in that they played him. I don't think he has any fans anywhere is the deal. And so enough people, neutral people hate him. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. As a guy who thought he was innovative, and I'm like, this guy's a jerk.
Yeah, he's probably burned enough bridges to be in that category. Yeah, okay. You've talked me into it. I could see that. On the aggregate, Chip Kelly qualifies as a villain. Probably has enough people that would love to clown on him if it doesn't work out at Ohio State.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point. It's a fun conversation to be able to have, though. You need villains. Like villains, villains are, I think, good for the sport. It's good that we have hate in our heart, that it doesn't always have to be just the rival or this specific player that all the hatred is directed towards. So yeah, fun conversation. All right, let's kick it to David Hale. Not often we talk about court cases on this show, but the developments between FSU, Clemson, the ACC, this whole deal, what could be in store for the grant of rights deal, for realignment in college football. Like, I understand there's fatigue on that, but I think it's really, really interesting stuff that David brought to the table, being there at that court hearing on Friday. So great stuff from him. Here is David Hale. Now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is ESPN's David Hale. David, you went from covering a court case to going to the NCAA tournament the same weekend. That kind of just explains the state of college athletics right now, does it not?
Yeah, it's funny that the highlight might be the wrong term to use, but the highlight of the court case, there was a moment where the ACC's lawyers said something to the effect, they were talking about the grant of rights and wording within the ACC's constitution and the grant of rights, and said something to the effect of like, when this was written, we never would have imagined we'd be suing one of our own league members. And the judge just goes, and yet here we sit. And that is exactly kind of where things are right now. There's no rhyme or reason or logic to most of this. It's just the life of being around college sports anymore.
Let's talk about this lawsuit right now, and all the lawsuits, I guess I should say, with Florida State, Clemson, the ACC. You were there last week. As you laid out, the ACC has this lawsuit against Florida State, while Florida State basically wants the details of this ACC media contract with ESPN, because very clearly Florida State wants to get out of the ACC. Clemson wants to get out of the ACC. They don't want to be restricted by the grant of rights, and that's what all lost in all this jargon. That's what everybody on that side wants. What was your main takeaway from this hearing, besides the desire for both parties to want to have jurisdiction in their own respective states?
Yeah, so to back up a little bit, there's effectively 4 different lawsuits right now. One from Clemson in the state of South Carolina that is basically suggesting that the grant of rights shouldn't be enforceable. One from Florida State in the state of Florida, which alleges a bunch of things, but largely is about the grant of rights being enforceable. And then 2 countersuits effectively from the ACC, one against each of those in Charlotte, North Carolina, that basically is asking a judge to uphold the grant of rights and suggest that you can't even challenge it. Within the grant of rights, within the multimedia contracts, it says you are not allowed to challenge the grant of rights even. So all of that had nothing really to do with what happened on Friday. We will get to those things theoretically somewhere down the road, but we're still a ways away from actually having lawyers arguing in court over the grant of rights. This right now is, to your point, largely a venue discussion. So Florida State is arguing that they filed a motion to dismiss the ACC's claim, and they're arguing on 2 points. One, that the idea of sovereign immunity. So as a federal or a state institution, they are considered state government. which says that one state can't really sue another state due to sovereign immunity. There's a lot of law that suggests that probably won't hold up. The other issue, which I find sort of interesting, is that they said basically there's a race to the courthouse situation. Whoever files first gets preference usually. And the ACC against Florida State filed first. Clemson actually filed before the ACC's countersuit in that. So that'll be interesting to see how those two might play out differently. But the ACC knew Florida State was going to have this Board of Trustees meeting that was going to vote to sue the ACC, and so they got in front of it by filing first. What they didn't do is take a full vote of their league membership to sue Florida State. They suggest that they didn't need to do that because what they were doing was going to court to essentially ask the court to maintain the status quo as opposed to changing anything significant. Florida State points out that within the ACC's constitution, it says you need for any sort of to initiate meaningful litigation against anyone, including a league member, you would need to get a 2/3 majority vote of the league membership first, which the ACC didn't do. If they didn't do that, then they're saying that the ACC doesn't have standing to have filed that lawsuit the day before Florida State, which would move the date of the lawsuit being filed to when they took that vote, which would put Florida State first, which would give them some you can see how ridiculous the whole conversation is. But the long and short of it, basically, it comes down to, are they going to try this case in Florida or in North Carolina? And the difference there is basically North Carolina is seen as slightly more favorable to the ACC, both for locality reasons, but because that suit is basically asking the judge to affirm the grant of rights, say yes, a grant of rights is a legally binding agreement. In Florida, they're thinking that's a slightly better venue for Florida State, and they're asking there's XYZ reasons why they should not be held to the grant of rights. What's fascinating, really, as we get further into this, nobody has ever challenged a grant of rights in a court of law before. And so there's not a lot of legal precedent here. So each step along the way, as sort of minutia as it seems, is creating, I think, a little bit of a playbook for what this might look like, because certainly if Florida State or if Clemson is able to extricate themselves from a grant of rights one way or another, there are a lot of ripple effects that go beyond the ACC. Certainly other ACC schools might follow, but this could have a lot of ripple effects for just the way that sports media marketing and other media marketing deals come about, because the grant of rights is it's a separate document from the media rights agreement, but they're so intertangled because it's basically an insurance policy for the networks that the schools that you're signing up to broadcast will still be a part of this deal for the length of the deal.
And in turn, an insurance policy for the schools that they're going to get this money.
Yeah.
Regardless of performance. And it's not like, oh, you have to win a national championship. You have to get to the college football playoff in order to get this money. And that's kind of the main point and why schools want this insurance policy in the first place. But I get the Florida State part of it, where they're going after the ACC by saying, well, you're by simply trying to say you're maintaining status quo and then not getting, the majority of the league or the 2/3 vote. Florida State's like, there's no way you would get the 2/3 vote from the league to be able to do this. Is that kind of the ground that they're trying to stand on in this, and why they're saying that the ACC is acting like too independently in this case, or is that kind of off base?
I think it's a little off base. They did take a vote in January subsequent to the initial to the lawsuit filing. So, and at that point, cat's out of the bag. So, I think it's a lot of this is very interesting because there's no, Clemson and Florida State have I should say, this sort of sounds like stupidly splitting hairs, but neither has said we want to leave the ACC. This is about leaving the ACC. They are basically, it's like telling your wife, like, I'm not looking to get divorced. I'd like to talk to some divorce attorneys about how much it costs to get divorced. It's probably the end of the marriage either way, but there is sort of a line of demarcation there. So there's a little bit of like, everybody who is still in the league needs to protect their asses a little bit too. So a lot of people have suggested, like, boy, if Florida State and Clemson leave, that's the end of the ACC. Well, it would certainly be the end of the ACC as we know it, but there's a lot that is still up in the air beyond just the grant of rights. So, even if the league, assuming the league doesn't dissolve, whoever leaves is going to pay something. We're arguing about how much they're going to pay, but they're going to pay something. And that something could be a lot. Florida State's attorneys suggested that if they were to leave the league today and get no relief in court from the grant of rights or the exit fee, you'd be looking at somewhere north of $550 million. Now, let's say two teams do that. You're looking at splitting up more than $1 billion among the remaining teams. So there is an incentive for the teams that aren't trying to leave tomorrow to stick this out and see what kind of a check they get as a parting gift. And then we kind of see where things go from there.
Couldn't, in theory, the ACC do what the Big 12 did? Just have a commissioner who understands, hey, look, this is happening. This is how we're going to be able to rework our two big schools in the conference leaving, and let's find a way to be able to make this work. There's more than enough in play. Like, what would that look like, do you think, if that were to happen? And if, however, if it was exit fee or no exit fee, and if it's just FSU and Clemson no longer in the ACC, like, what does that part look like then on the ACC? Like, what would be the pursuit?
So I'll try to answer that as simply as I can, and then maybe we can touch on some of the bigger picture ramifications of that. The big difference between what happened with the Big 12 and the ACC is, and why the Big 12 was much more amenable to negotiating with Oklahoma and Texas, is when that decision was made for them to leave to the SEC, there was 3 years left on their grant of rights, and they stayed for 2 of them.
True.
So they basically bought out 1 year of the grant of rights. The ACC's grant of rights runs through 2036, so there's 12 more years on that deal. And so we're talking about, for Florida State and Clemson's side, a much bigger number, which might be prohibitive. And for the ACC, there's just not a lot of incentive to argue here. And I've seen a few lawyers who are much smarter than I am about the law kind of going through this and saying that, who knows exactly. Again, this is sort of uncharted waters, but there doesn't seem to be the strongest. Like, if you're looking at who has the stronger legal case right now, the ACC has the stronger legal case. So that's part of the problem. Now, what would happen if they did it? They added SMU, Cal, and Stanford, who will officially all join the league this summer. And that was part of a sort of chess move to get ahead of this. So their current TV contract with ESPN requires, I believe it's 15 league members for the contract to remain intact. It doesn't say who those league members have to be. It just says 15 members. Well, now they're up to 18, assuming you're including Notre Dame, who isn't part of football, but in everything else. So they can afford to lose 2 or even a third team and still have the TV contract that they have, no problems. And that's ESPN's locked in with them through 2036, the same as supposedly those other teams are. Clearly, there would be other lawsuits that would follow this. ESPN, I don't think would be thrilled, obviously, with how that goes. But the other thing, and I've talked to a few folks in television and a few ADs who have suggested, like, this is such a sweetheart deal for ESPN right now that they have with the ACC, that even if Florida State and Clemson left, because of how cheap they're getting the ACC for, because of sort of the money that they've already got on the table, and because of the amount of TV slots that you need to fill, they'd probably be fine with that. So there is a look-in window where they could extricate themselves from this contract. But they'd be unlikely to do that at this point. Now, that's speculation from other folks. I, as an ESPN employee, have no awareness of this. This is way beyond my pay grade. So I don't know. Long story short, to your point, they could do sort of a Big 12 thing. But I guess the last part that I would sort of bring into this is, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too. I mean, if Clemson and Florida State leave and go to the Big 10 or the SEC, and I think presumably you would probably see 1 to 2 to 3 more ACC teams follow suit if the numbers came out right. What's left outside of the Big 12 and the SEC? Like, who are the brands that move the needle? And I'm not trying to knock the Big 12 here, but there is not a brand in the Big 12 that the SEC or the Big 10 would be like, yep, come on over here, we want you. Like, for anything other than like adding some geographical perspective or convenience or something like that. So it's almost like once Clemson and Florida State leave, I don't know what is stopping it from a conversation about, like, it is just the Big 2 and then everybody else.
The only thing is Notre Dame. The only thing. Right. Like, if you were to take that money that theoretically the ACC could get if there was some sort of settlement, even if it wasn't the $550 million, whatever it is, and you take that money and incentivize Notre Dame even more to say, hey, look, let's make this happen. We understand the NBC side of it. Maybe there's some sort of middle ground where they can make that work, and it could benefit the ACC in the long term to have those rights tied into this as well, and find a way to just get Notre Dame football on board. Like, that feels like the only power play that the ACC could possibly have left.
And there's a lot, I don't know how to really categorize the numbers, but there are people within the ACC who are more than a bit frustrated about the lack of creativity on the ACC's part in trying to find more workable solutions here. And frankly, every day that passes, the potential number of fixes gets smaller and smaller. So, even Cal, Stanford, and SMU, it took a lot to get that done. There's a lot of people who didn't like it. And I would argue, I understand the rationale for why they did it. Those three schools all fit sort of the pedigree of the other schools that are sort of the problem. And I hate kind of using it this way because, like, I'll use Wake Forest as an example. I love Wake Forest football. Go watch a Wake Forest football game. Until last year, they're fun. It is a school that is invested. It's not a big fan base, but it's a passionate fan base. Dave Clawson's a great coach. They've had a lot of cool players come through there. But Wake Forest ain't generating the money for TV networks that change the game. It's a small private school with a relatively small alumni base that may or may not be football focused. Well, Cal, Stanford, SMU at least has football-focused alumni, but it's, again, small private school. Like, the reason that the Big Ten and the SEC have the bandwidth that they have is because they're big public schools inside those leagues that move the needle with a huge built-in audience. And I think there's a lot of people who are frustrated that, the Big 12 got to be the narrative around the Big 12 for a league that basically doesn't have a single team that the ACC would really want right now as currently constructed. The narrative around the Big 12 is much better than the narrative around the ACC. And there's a lot of people frustrated that the ACC has allowed that to happen. And that's just narrative. It's not even the facts. It's just a narrative. So the ACC has been very flat-footed. And I've also talked to a number of folks. I think that the average AD in the ACC gets it. The average president and chancellor in the ACC, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of people who think it's still 1995 in terms of the business model.
Yeah, that's the part that's difficult. That's you could see that path. And my guy Brett Freelander talks about, who does great work for us at Saturday Road. He talks about that a lot, about the Wake Forest dynamic of it. And all right, well, what does this actually look like for a school like that moving forward? And that's why it can be a bit of a sticking point. My favorite tweet of yours during this on Friday, as all this is unfolding, was the ACC lawyer talking about how FSU was claiming that they never held a board vote to approve the grant of rights. And the ACC lawyer is like, well, why have we been sending them all this money? Does it feel like that's the exact reason, that ignorance a bit about the contract that FSU signed in the first place? Is that kind of why we're at this place of angst right now with all parties?
Yeah, it's funny that Clemson's lawsuit, basically one of the things that it suggests is that a grant of rights should not be enforceable once a member leaves the league. And literally, the first paragraph of the grant of rights says, this is enforceable no matter what you do. So, this is sort of what we're arguing over. There's no magic beans here. We're basically, it's sort of like the Alabama Grand Canyon game. Nobody has a plan. They're just beating the hell out of each other in the paint to see what happens. I don't, I think the one, there's a lot of, you look on social media, particularly the Florida State fans who have been over the ACC for years, think that there's some magic solution here. The problem is the ACC, Florida State, and Clemson are all playing poker with a really bad hand. And they're all trying to figure out a way, how can I win with one of my favorite Simpsons lines is the royal sampler. It's you got a little of everything and none of it's good. That they are looking to a bunch of really bad options and trying to figure out the least bad option. And so some of these lawsuits, again, there's a very good reason that Clemson and Florida State have not said we're leaving the ACC. And the reason they haven't said it is twofold. One, they don't know if they can. Because there is a more than reasonable chance that these court cases don't go well for them, and the price tag to get out of the ACC is prohibitive. And two, no one, the SEC and the Big Ten particularly, is going to offer an invite to you to join their league if they don't know that they have access to your media rights. So nothing can happen yet. So frankly, we're in a holding pattern for at least the near future. And I would put a timeline of maybe 2 years on that. And even that doesn't say, like, at the end of 2 years, we've got a resolution. I don't know that we do.
Yeah, that's the thing that Matt Hayes has been bringing up for a while now. It's like, hey, look, even if Florida State gets out of this, it's not like the SEC and Big Ten are going to come calling and say, hey, come on board. Everything's perfectly fine. It's not like it's, the girl that they've been eyeing at the bar and they all of a sudden find out that she's single. There's so much more that goes into this. So, like, it almost feels... Is independence the most likely option if they get out of this contract and trying to negotiate some sort of a TV deal with one of these big players? And I would guess it's not going to be ESPN if they're trying to get out of the ESPN contract. But is that the most likely path for Clemson and Florida State if they're able to get out of this, as opposed to saying, well, it means that they are inevitably going to join the SEC or the Big Ten?
It's a really good question. What is the most likely outcome? I would almost be foolish to suggest I know what the most likely outcome is, because I don't.
Fair.
It's like a bunch of outcomes are possible, none that have particularly high odds. Independence is one option, or maybe the Big 12 would be another option that is essentially a stopgap, right? So I've talked to a ton of ADs. And almost no one thinks that by the year 2030, 2031, that the business model of college football is going to look anything like it does today. So let's say there's a football breakaway. Let's say there's a Power 2 breakaway, whatever it is. Like, maybe you just need enough runway to get you to that place. And whether that's, hey, we're going to bully the ACC into giving us more money every year, like a higher stake of the pie that gets us to that place. Maybe we go independent to get to that place. Maybe we go join the Big 12, who at least has really no upside over the ACC, except that their TV contract expires in 29 as opposed to 2036. So any of these might be a bridge to get to that next place, on the assumption that the next place is going to be a much different place than it is today. And I think a lot of people have asked, like, well, Florida State was willing to be, and in fact very eager to be, the canary in the coal mine on all of this. Why did Clemson follow their lawsuit too, as opposed to just, let's see what happens with Florida State and we'll hang back and wait and pounce when the time is right? I think part of that is getting on this runway to wherever we need to be in a couple of years, because there's not, none of this is going to be simple, and none of the outcomes are certain, other than the fact that, like, the one thing Clemson and Florida State I think are 100% certain of is we can't stay in the ACC under the status quo financial situation and in 5 years still be a sustainable national championship contender. It's in their mind, that is a non-starter. So whatever the outcome is that is not that is better.
Yeah, which is interesting because, I almost want to push back on that with Clemson and Florida State, because if the business model does change, and if it is like, hey, we're going to have, and I guess, they're trying to get ahead of the whole, like, media contract pay for play and how much that could be tied to collective bargaining. And that's where the money's going to come from instead of these private sources. Because if it's private sources that are funding this and it's just collectives and all that stuff, Clemson and FSU are probably holding on right now, and it's probably fine. And they're probably like, hey, we're just going to get the best booster donors, and we're just going to find a way to make this work. But that part right there, and why this sport is changing, is what they're trying to get out ahead of, as much as
100%.
someone like, so there's going to be people next year, like if Florida State and Clemson are, in the playoff or something like that, saying like, oh, I guess they didn't need to change conferences. And that's really not the case of what they're trying to get out ahead of. And why I kind of side with them, because it seems like greed, but in reality, there's a lot more foresight going on here than probably the average college football consumer realizes.
Yeah, I think you're at such an important point, and it's the thing that I think most people are sort of caught up in the now and not seeing the big picture. It's not an apples to apples comparison, but Greg Sankey talking about the auto bids and wanting to get more power teams into the NCAA tournament, and everybody's like, well, look at how the little guys did. They're winning these games. as the notion for why it shouldn't change. That's why he wants it to change, because if they would all lose in the first round or the second round, he'd be fine with it. It's that they're taking up money from winning these games. They're too good at it. Like, you can't, it is, I think we're so kind of hard. It's hard to imagine again, because what comes next? It's so malleable right now. And that's just the thing, is like, you've got to have some, like, I think everybody sees the writing on the wall that players are going to get paid. Everybody sees the writing on the wall that collectives and NIL, as it constitutes, is not sustainable for anybody. And you say, so it's got to change. That means money's going to, at some point, in some way, be coming from us to the players. How do we make that work? And the answer is, if you're making the ACC's money compared to what the SEC or Big Ten are making, you can't. It's not. If they have twice as much revenue coming in, they're going to effectively be able to pay players twice as much. And what player is going to be like, yeah, let me take half to go play for Florida State when I could go play for Florida for twice as much? Like, it's not reality.
There's such great irony in Clemson being at the center of this, of like the Dabo culture and stuff like that. Like, Clemson's involved in this lawsuit because they're realizing that they actually do need the money, and it's not just the Clemson culture that's going to bring kids there, in the 2020s decade. It's fascinating. Great stuff, man. Really, really awesome reporting that you're doing right now on just a very 2020s college football story. Looking forward to it moving forward. We'll do it again soon. We'll talk about actual football.
I want to point this out. Everybody bashes sports writers. We're just dumb wannabe jocks. You got to learn law. You got to learn politics. You got to learn finance. I'm not smart enough to do this job anymore. Damn it.
Ben Portnoy was telling me a couple of weeks ago, he's like, should I just go into law school instead of journalism school? Like, what are we doing here?
And the answer is yes. Even without this, the answer would have been yes, but especially now.
Yep, 100% right. Great stuff, man. We'll do it again soon.
All right, see you.
Jersey contest. Will, it is the last entry into the jersey contest. Before I set you up here to close this out, our winners so far that we will be voting on to be able to decide our winner. But the jerseys that have advanced: Waterboy Bobby Boucher, Cubs Ernie Banks, Nuggets Dikembe Mutombo, Throwback Saquon Barkley, High School Zion Williamson, LSU Shaquille O'Neal. Voting, depending on when you're listening to this, voting is still available for our most recent round of jerseys, so nothing final on that just yet. Go follow the SDS Pod on Twitter. That's at the SDS Pod if you want to be able to vote on that. So we're going to do Jason Kidd in the next round of voting, and then the one that you are currently wearing, another 90s NBA star that I did not recognize this. I'm a bit embarrassed that I did not recognize this guy's high school jersey.
Yes, I will say really quick that Saquon jersey, I think, just appreciated in value because now it's really a throwback jersey. Now it's like, I remember when he was a Giant talking about some dudes. So I'm telling you, man, your closet's going up in value because of this. Anyway, so a guy that really, really, really fits into a lot of what we talked about today, right? A guy who kind of united parts of America, a guy who was ahead of his time, I think, and a guy who was right at the apex of old school commissioners, talking about more of a Mike Slive, to new school commissioners, right? Talking about like a Greg Sankey today. And his version of that was David Stern in the NBA. This is Allen Iverson, Bethel legend, or Bethel from Hampton, Virginia. That part of Virginia is a very interesting area. One of my coworkers from there. Hampton, obviously, the college is from there. So it's a very interesting like demographic region. Michael Vick is from around that area. It's a very specific dialect that you can kind of pick it up when you see it. But one thing that Allen Iverson was, to his detriment, I think, might have been a little bit too real, a little bit too honest, right? He was a walking, like how all athletes get PR training today. A lot of people will cite Allen Iverson and his realness for why that was an issue. And that's what I always loved about Allen Iverson, was that he was unembarrassingly himself. There are so many stories about him going to TGI Fridays in Philly and buying out the whole restaurant and having fun with the waiters and stuff. And I think overall he was a man of the people. I mean, the thing that he was known for was his like practice rant, which was seen at the time as this guy not committing and being kind of a diva. But when you look back at it, he was playing 42 plus minutes a game, taking every shot for this team, putting his heart and soul into it, as Ed Reed said, right? So I think that he had a little bit of the agency that players have today. At the time, Larry Brown, another guy, man without a country, right? Was fighting with Allen Iverson, talking about I represent authority. You got to fall in line. Allen Iverson was saying, look, if this is up to me, big dog. All right, so you go respect me because I am where this team goes. And not in those words. He was much more political than that. People do that today, and it's embraced. So I would just say, like, the embrace. I'll just go ahead and say it. The embracing of black culture through the cornrows, through the baggy clothes that David Stern then cut down on, said everybody has got to wear business attire. You have to look a certain way to represent the partners here. I think was ahead of its time, but opened up a lot of conversations that put us to where we are today. So I've always viewed Allen Iverson as a visionary. I really have. I think that because he was so quick-witted and so kind of like off the cuff with his presentation, he was seen as unserious. But I think that if you look at the core of what he was saying, a lot of that stuff is true, and it rings true today.
Hot take. His high school football highlight tape is better than his high school basketball highlight tape.
Yep.
I feel like those clips are all in black and white, even though he's playing in the early 90s. Am I wrong about that? Like, when I picture his high school highlights where he's just juking somebody out of their shoes and he played quarterback and was incredible. Mm-hmm. I just picture him in black and white. And so when I first saw you in that jersey, that Packers colored jersey, I didn't picture Allen Iverson at all. And Allen Iverson high school football jersey would be another incredible find as well.
That would be a better one. You're totally right about that, because he's one of the few people talk about, like Randy Moss too, could have been number one in basketball and football. He was a little guy though, but his highlights, to your point, were electric. Like, think the fastest quarterback you see in like Johnny Manziel times two, because this dude was putting dudes in a blender. He was athletic. He had a rocket arm, and yeah, it all just felt like it came so easy to him.
Vic wanted to be Iverson. That was the vision. Like Vic wanted to be Allen Iverson, Newport News, and that whole like that whole region of the country just like truly embraced what it was. Speaking of 30 for 30s, that Allen Iverson one, it's a good one. I haven't watched that in a really long time, but very interesting insight into like his upbringing and how atypical it was, and kind of a one of one type path that he was trying to be able to embark on. I like that one though. You had a couple of high school entries. You had 3 high school entries: Zion, Burrow, and AI. Yeah.
Yep. I got those at the same store in the Mall of Louisiana. My people at the Mall of Louisiana, y'all got an aquarium, y'all got a throwback jersey store, and y'all got a throwback video game store. I would never leave that place if I had the ability.
The high schools get a cut of that? I'd like to think so.
Who's to say? Yeah, I mean, it depends. I'm sure it's more. That's actually a great question. How do they license? A lot of these are Michelin Nest. I'm gonna follow up on that. That's really interesting.
Let me know. High schools, AD, athletic departments that are getting this money from like a famous player that they have that's in pro sports, and everybody wants to buy their high school jersey. It'd be a good way to get some sort of kickback. All right. So yeah, like I said, we got final voting. It's going to be our final 8, and we're going to just do the 2 groups of 4, and we'll be able to settle on a winner for the jersey contest, which will be probably decided in the next week. I think that's going to be the plan. All right. Lad of the week. Obvious one. You know where I'm going. I'm going Jack Golke. Earmuff at Kentucky fans. You've heard enough probably about the Oakland sharpshooter by now. It's just such a quintessential March Madness story. Like a 24-year-old Division II transfer that is going to be playing in a YMCA like next week is just out here shooting all over these future NBA players at Kentucky. I mean, it was unbelievable. 10 made threes. Nothing Kentucky did just worked at all, and like whatever pump fake, screen, over under like that you were coming off of just did not work with him. The fact that he only attempted 8 2-pointers the entire year is so perfect. I mean, just like I want to go back. Surely somebody tweeted this out at some point when he was going off. I just need the montage of all of his 2-pointers this year. It's a 1-minute video probably, but I want to see these exact situations in which he took it to. It had to have just been all open layups, right? Like just clear.
He's got the green light on certain situations, Connor. If it's a wide open layup, he's going to the rack.
Breakaway steal or something like that. He just pulls up from 3 still. I saw a kid do that once when I was in 5th grade, and I'll never forget this. And I thought it was the most baffling thing I've ever seen. This kid who was in 5th grade, breakaway, pulls up top of the key, And it's like, and it was a kid that was like 2 years older than me. So like
Mm-hmm.
when you see somebody do something like that, you're like, oh, that's just what older kids do. A
And
little
then you
bit
hear the
more
coach screaming over your head because this was like the 2000s. See, he was a visionary just like Iverson. He saw what was coming.
Yeah, this was like 2000 or like 1999, like well before the 3-pointer was
Yeah.
actually a thing. And it went like in and out, but it went in.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, gosh, imagine having that type of confidence to ever take a pull-up three, which, let's be honest, Jack Kolke has done probably countless times in his career, outside of those 8 instances in which he didn't. But yeah, it's just wild to think that guy in 2 NCAA tournament games attempted 37 3-pointers. I mean, that is just crazy. In Lexington, I think his middle name starts with an F. That's just going to be how he's referred to moving forward. The
His
Buffalo
last name
Wild.
is Calipari.
What if we found out that there was like a distant relation to those two? That wouldn't end well. That really wouldn't.
No, I meant like his middle name is F, and then Calipari. It's this guy, F. Calipari.
Rough. Calipari with a C or Calipari with a K? That's local joke. Some will get that, some won't. But yeah, just really, really cool to be able to see for those who didn't have a Kentucky rooting interest. Felt very bad for my sister-in-law, my brother, my sister-in-law's mom, who was just Kentucky BBN through and through. Watching that game had to just be absolute torture. Thought about doing a little bit of like a Cal in football terms conversation, but then I thought, you know what, Andy Staples kind of laid out all of the great points that are involved in that contract. So didn't really want to get into that.
It's Les Miles.
There's some of that. I did when Nick Roush was on, I compared it to Dabo. Like now that we can't make the Jimbo comp anymore.
Yeah.
But there is some there is definitely some Les Miles. And now I'm going to be thinking of this the rest of the day. Okay, let's circle back on that. Let's put a pin in that conversation. I do like that comp. But yeah, Jack Kolke, have yourself a week, man. Legend. When he comes back and he's like coaching JV basketball someday, and people are going to look at him and be like, is that the guy that like dropped 30 on Kentucky in that game? Yep. That's Jack Kolke. Can't take that away from him.
Yep. This is one of the few that we had the same guy. I saw it and did not change it because I was like, this is the guy. There's no reason to get a second guy. This is the guy. I loved that interview with SVP. Shout out to another DMV native. That's so cool. He has him and his coach. They look like they're in a Zoom meeting. I don't know if you saw that interview, but the framing, it was like so clearly like we've never been here before. The coach, that Van Pelt asks him like, Van Pelt asks his coach, hey, how did it feel to have a player who could hit from anywhere? And the coach immediately was like, it's everyone's night. Some nights, that was just his night. Was not trying to say this guy's a star, give him all the credit. He was such an old school. He would have been screaming at your buddy taking the three if it wasn't this specific guy. And it was like, that was it, seeing them just be part of it. And I'm glad you brought up the quote about the 8 baskets too. That was in that interview. His other quote directly after the game where he was like, look, like I'm real about this. Like I don't have a future in the NBA, but for a night I can be on the same stage and compete with and beat these guys. It's honestly refreshing to hear someone be that real about it. And as I'm looking here on the ESPN side of the ESPN bet section, how much money and capitalism has invaded all that we love about sports. It's good to see these guys that are just, kind of one, like this is his 15 minutes, as he said, like he's here for the love of the game. He's put in years at this school. He's here for the name on the front and the back of a jersey, and it's kind of it. Maybe he'll get some NIL stuff going forward, but it's not why he did it. He's not here trying to hit the portal and do all this stuff. So yeah, I think this is the kind of guy that made us fall in love with college sports in general, right? Not just because he's like a goofy Caucasian guy who we could relate to, right? But a guy that is like, you're here for the love of the game. You're not here for money or endorsement deals. I think it's so cool.
Guy's probably on Cameo by now, I would assume.
Yep.
If he's
Cleaning
not,
up on Cameo. His bank account's probably so fat. If he's like kind of done with his career too, it's like, I'll say anything for this next 2 weeks, brother. I'm going to cash in.
$20, $20 videos, man. Those would go a long way. Like those that add up. Do you know how many Louisville fans would want to sign up for a Jack Kolke cameo? I mean, they were talking about like how they had like $8,000 worth of t-shirts that they were selling to Louisville fans, just trolling Kentucky. Like, oh gosh.
Well, and that's what NIL should be about. It's I have a big performance, so I'm going to capitalize off of that. It's merit based, right? It's not I'm a right guard and I may play for your team in 3 years, so here's $100K. It's like, no, you actually beat Kentucky, brother. You should probably that's a good idea, objectively.
Yep. unbelievable. Will be talked about many, many years from now, Jack Golke's performance. If you have not, leave us a 5-star review, subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can watch every episode of the Saturday Down South podcast. Follow us on the app formerly known as Twitter, at the SDS Pod, at Sat Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go So Hard. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.